Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're embarking on quite an incredible journey. We're looking at the genesis of American liberty, focusing on the years 1754 to 1800.
Yeah, a really crucial period.
Think of it as our shortcut to understanding how these, scattered colonies actually managed to transform themselves into a whole new nation.
And for this deep dive, our source material is, well, it's a pretty comprehensive academic overview. It's packed with rich information.
So what's the plan?
Our mission, like always, is to really distill all of this for you, our listener. We want to give you a clear handle on the what, the why, and maybe most importantly, the so what of American independence.
Right. Get the knowledge quickly, but, properly, without feeling buried in details.
Exactly. And you'll find, I think, that this period, even though it feels like ancient history sometimes, it holds some really surprising facts and foundational insights into, the core identity of the United States today.
Okay, sounds good. So, with that big picture in mind, let's rewind a bit. Let's really dig into how this all got started. Trace the seeds of conflict that eventually set the stage for revolution.
Right. So, mid-18th century, you've got this intense rivalry heating up between Britain and France, especially in North America.
We're talking competition over land, trade.
Yeah, particularly over the Ohio River Valley. It was fertile, strategically important. British colonial expansion was seriously threatening French-Indian trade networks. And crucially, it was also threatening American Indian autonomy.
And there's a surprising detail here, isn't there, involving someone pretty famous later on.
Yes. A young Virginian officer named George Washington. He pops up surprisingly early. In 1753, he's sent to warn the French to, back off.
Just a warning at first.
At first,
Yeah.
but then in 1754, he leads a surprise attack near Fort Duquesne. And that skirmish, well, that's widely seen as the immediate spark, the thing that kicked off what became a much larger, even global conflict.
Which we often call the French and Indian War.
Indeed. Though that name, the French and Indian War, it's actually quite misleading, isn't it?
How so?
Well, the main fight was Britain versus France. Both sides did have Native American allies. It's true, the British managed to secure some alliances too, not just the French.
Okay, so not just French and Indians versus British.
Not entirely. And even before the fighting really got going, colonial delegates met at the Albany Congress, sometimes called the Albany Convention. They were trying to coordinate defense.
And Benjamin Franklin was there.
He was. And he proposed his Albany Plan of Union. The idea was a council, colonial representatives, managing defense, trade, that sort of thing.
Did it fly?
No, it was ultimately rejected, mostly because of the taxes it would have required. But, and this is important, it really laid some crucial groundwork for the revolutionary assemblies that came later.
So the war happens, Britain wins, but there's a catch.
A huge catch, the cost. This war was incredibly expensive. It basically doubled British national debt and, get this, quintupled the cost of just running the colonies.
Wow, quintupled.
Yeah, and that enormous expense directly, set the stage for the British government trying to raise money and tighten its control over the American colonies.
And you see the consequences almost immediately.
You do, like the Proclamation Line of 1763. After increasing conflicts with Native Americans, Britain drew this line, basically forbidding colonists from migrating west over the Appalachian Mountains.
How did the colonists take that?
They largely ignored it. They felt, that they were entitled to the spoils of war. They'd fought on this land. They felt it was theirs now.
And this is also when we see things like Pontiac's Rebellion.
Exactly. Pontiac's raids were a direct response to this colonial encroachment onto native lands. Resistance was definitely happening.
Okay, so the war debt leads Britain to change its approach.
Precisely. Which brings us neatly to taxation without representation, the principle that ignited a revolution. That huge war debt forced Britain to pivot sharply away from its earlier policy of salutary neglect.
Salutary neglect. That was the sort of hands-off approach, right?
Yeah. For a long time, Britain had mostly let the colonies govern themselves and force their own laws. But now, that leniency was over. They brought in a three-pronged plan.
Which was?
1, enforce existing laws much more strictly. 2, extend wartime measures into peacetime, like the Quartering Act of 1765, making colonists house British soldiers. And 3, the big one, impose new taxes.
And these taxes just kept coming.
They did, a whole series of them. You had early revenue acts like the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, then the Stamp Act in 1765. That one hit everyday life because it taxed all paper goods.
That must have caused a stir.
Oh, absolutely. Then you get the Declaratory Act in 66, where Parliament basically said, we're still in charge, we can make laws for you whenever we want. Then the Townshend Acts in 67, taxing imports like tea and glass.
And it culminates after the Boston Tea Party.
Right, with the Coercive Acts, or what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts in 1774, super punitive. Closed Boston Harbor until the dump tea was paid for, brought in another quartering act. It was a real crackdown.
So looking at all this protest it's building was no taxation without representation. Really the absolute core issue. Or were other things bubbling under the surface too?
That's a good question. I mean, there were definitely other grievances, for sure. But that phrase, no taxation without representation, it just became this incredibly powerful rallying cry. It perfectly captured a fundamental disagreement about how government should work.
A clash of ideas.
Totally. The colonists believed in what they called actual representation, meaning only people they directly chose could represent their interests. Your neighbors, basically.
Makes sense.
But the British argued for virtual representation. They claimed Parliament represented all British classes and, by extension, all British subjects, including the colonists, even if the colonists didn't vote for any MPs.
So two completely different ways of seeing things.
Exactly. A real clash of political philosophies.
And this disagreement didn't just stay theoretical. It led to actual organized resistance pretty early on.
It did. Look at the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. You had 27 delegates from 9 colonies coming together to petition Parliament.
Still trying to work within the system at that point.
Very much so. They were careful to identify themselves as loyal subjects of the king. They weren't talking independence yet. And around the same time, you see the committees of correspondence starting up.
Like in Massachusetts.
Yeah, like those in Massachusetts in early 75. They were coordinating efforts, trying to stop supplies from reaching the British Army. It shows this growing intercolonial cooperation. Really important groundwork being laid.
And we start hearing from some very influential voices, right? Colonial leaders making powerful arguments.
Oh, absolutely. You have figures like John Adams, John Dickinson, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, writing these incredibly powerful essays and giving fiery speeches. They're articulating the colonists' grievances, warning about British overreach, arguing passionately for liberty.
Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." That wasn't just talk, was it?
Not at all. That speech, given in 1775, it was a passionate argument that war was basically unavoidable at that point and that liberty was worth dying for. It really captured the mood, how much things were intensifying.
And it's crucial to remember it wasn't just these well-known men. There were popular movements involving ordinary people, laborers, artisans, and women.
Absolutely vital. Women played a huge role. Look at Abigail Adams. She wasn't just watching from the sidelines. Her letters show her actively discussing revolutionary politics, expressing real anger at British tyranny.
And Crispus Attucks.
He became this powerful symbol after the Boston Massacre in 1770. When British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing him and others, it just fueled the outrage.
And the Daughters of Liberty, what were they up to?
They were all about economic action, spearheading boycotts of British goods. Women started hand-spinning clothes so they wouldn't have to buy British textiles, making their own herbal teas instead of taxed British tea. Real practical resistance.
Like the Edenton Tea Party.
Exactly. In 1775, you had 51 women in North Carolina publicly pledging to boycott British goods. It really proved women were active revolutionaries, even if some in Britain tried to mock them for it.
Then you had the more, shall we say, direct action groups.
It's like the Sons of Liberty. They were organizing protests, boycotts, sometimes using intimidation. They were the ones behind the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
The famous tea dumping.
Yep, about 50 of them, disguised as American Indians, a symbol of American identity, ironically dumping 45 tons of British tea into Boston Harbor.
Yeah.
A hugely symbolic act of defiance.
And groups like the Green Mountain Boys.
Right, up in what's now Vermont. Led by Ethan Allen, they captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British in 1775. Allen's demand for surrender was supposedly in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Quite theatrical.
So with these acts of defiance ramping up, it feels like the colonists weren't just pushing back against policies anymore. They were starting to embrace some really profound new ideas. Let's shift gears and delve into those philosophical foundations, the ideas that really fueled this battle.
Yeah, and what's really important to grasp here is that revolution wasn't, like, inevitable. Not even as late as 1774.
Really? Even with all that tension?
Well, Many colonists initially just wanted reconciliation. They wanted their liberties protected as British citizens. Remember the Stamp Act Congress in 65? They petitioned Parliament as loyal subjects.
So what changed? Why did reconciliation fail?
King George III and Parliament basically refused to negotiate. They saw the colonies as being in rebellion and wouldn't deal with them on those terms. That refusal effectively shut the door on reconciliation and, pushed the colonies much further down the road to independence.
Okay, so if reconciliation was off the table, where did these ideas about liberty and self-governance actually come from? What was influencing their thinking?
That's a fantastic question, because this desire for liberty wasn't born in a vacuum. It was deeply, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment.
Thinkers like John Locke.
Locke was absolutely central. His ideas about government resting on the consent of the governed and about humans having natural rights, life, liberty, and property granted by a creator, not by kings or governments. Huge.
And Rousseau.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the social contract was also key. He argued that if a government makes laws without the people's consent, those laws aren't really valid. You can see how that directly connects to the whole taxation without representation anger.
Right. And Montesquieu.
Baron de Montesquieu advocated for the separation of powers, splitting government into executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The idea was to prevent any one part from becoming too powerful to preserve liberty.
So it wasn't just what they believed, but how these ideas spread.
Exactly. That's the aha moment. These weren't just abstract philosophical ideas anymore. They became the common language people used to talk about freedom, transforming dusty old philosophy into, a direct justification for rebellion in the minds of everyday folks.
And religion played a part too, the Great Awakening.
Definitely. It strengthened this view many Americans had of themselves as a chosen people blessed with liberty. You see it in diaries, like Sarah Osborne's in 1767, praying for moral and political salvation, linking faith and the cause.
Phyllis Wheatley, too.
Yes, Phyllis Wheatley, the enslaved African-American poet. She cleverly wove together religious and political themes, suggesting liberty was a divine gift for everyone. It was a subtle but powerful message.
But these Enlightenment ideas, were they common knowledge or more for the elites?
Initially more familiar to the educated elite, but that really changed with Thomas Paine. His pamphlet Common Sense in 1776 was a game changer.
Why was it so effective?
He used plain, everyday language. He used biblical examples people understood to argue against monarchy, calling it, I think the quote is, most barefaced falsity ever imposed on mankind. Just fiery stuff.
So he made the complex ideas accessible.
Totally. Paine basically articulated what tons of colonists were feeling but maybe couldn't put into words. His pamphlet massively shifted public opinion away from hoping for reconciliation towards demanding outright independence.
Which leads directly to the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. July 1776.
Yeah.
Drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson, it's just infused with those Enlightenment ideas, natural rights, the social contract. It was the formal break, the announcement to the world. Accepted July 2nd, made public July 4th.
Okay, so the ideas are out there, the declaration is made. Now comes the hard part. Actually winning the war, the American Revolution. Looking back, it really does seem like an improbable victory, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely improbable. You really have to understand the context here.
Britain was a superpower.
The superpower, the most powerful nation on earth, huge military advantages, massive financial resources, and America. They had the Continental Army, but it was poorly armed, poorly trained, often poorly supplied.
Plus, fighting your main trading partner must have wrecked the economy.
Devastating economic consequences. George Washington himself, famously despaired at times. There's that quote, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" It really shows the scale of the uphill battle.
And not everyone was even on board with the Patriot cause, were they?
Not by a long shot. Probably no more than half the colonists actively supported the Patriots. You had a large chunk who tried to stay neutral, just keep your heads down, and then you had about 60,000 loyalists who actively sided with the British, even joining their forces.
And the British tried to use divisions, like with slavery.
Right. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 offered freedom to enslaved people owned by patriots if they fought for the British. It was an attempt to cause chaos, especially in the South.
Did it work? Did many join the British?
Some did, but Washington eventually responded by allowing black men to enlist in the Continental Army, too. Around 5,000 black men ended up fighting for the Patriot cause, so it was complex.
Despite all these massive challenges, they somehow pulled it off. What were the key factors for American success?
Well, Washington's leadership was absolutely critical. He wasn't maybe the most brilliant battlefield tactician initially, but he learned. And crucially, he realized they probably couldn't beat the British in a straight-up fight.
So a different strategy.
A strategy of attrition. Basically, keep the army alive, avoid catastrophic defeats, make the war long and costly, and wear down the British resources and their will to keep fighting.
And moments like the Battle of Trenton.
Huge! That surprise attack across the Delaware River in December 1776, it was a desperately needed victory, a massive boost to morale when things looked really bleak. Showed Washington's tactical ability, too.
But they couldn't have done it alone, right?
Yeah.
Foreign help was vital.
Oh, absolutely essential. The role of foreign alliances, especially France, cannot be overstated.
And the turning point for getting French help was Saratoga.
Yes, the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, that convinced the French that the Americans actually had a chance. Benjamin Franklin over in Paris did some masterful diplomacy to persuade King Louis VI to formally ally with the Americans.
Was France really into the ideals of the Revolution?
Not necessarily. For France, it was mostly about geopolitics, a chance to weaken their rival, Britain, after losing the 7 Years' War. But their support was crucial nonetheless.
Did other countries join in?
Yes, a year after France, Spain joined the war against Britain, and later the Dutch Republic did too. This stretched British resources even thinner, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. The French provided guns, money, troops, and critically, naval support.
Which brings us to the end game, Yorktown.
Exactly, the decisive Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The French Navy played a key role, blockading the coast while Washington's army, supported by French troops, besieged the British forces under Cornwallis, forcing their surrender. That was pretty much the end of major fighting.
And then the peace treaty.
It's the Paris Peace Treaty in 1783. Britain formally recognized American independence, and the treaty established the new nation's western boundary at the Mississippi River, an improbable victory made real.
So independence achieved. But winning the war was one thing. Building a nation was another challenge entirely. Now we get into forging a nation. This period from 1783 to 1800 is about figuring out government, identity, dealing with all sorts of challenges.
Right. And let's start by looking at the influence of revolutionary ideals, how those ideas about liberty and equality started to ripple through society and even globally.
That phrase, all men are created equal, from the Declaration, it must have immediately raised questions about existing inequalities, right? Like slavery.
It absolutely did. It sparked this increased awareness, this tension, and one of the most significant impacts was a direct challenge to slavery, especially in the North.
What kind of actions were taken?
Well, several northern states began the process of abolishing slavery. Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 was a landmark, the first legislative effort of its kind. It didn't free everyone immediately, but freed children born to enslaved mothers after it passed, once they hit age 28.
So a gradual approach.
Yes. And you had abolitionists like Anthony Benezet arguing against slavery, using both Enlightenment ideas and Christian principles. Free Black leaders like Prince Hall used the Revolution's own rhetoric, look at his 1777 Freedom Petition in Massachusetts, demanding equality.
Did the national government do anything?
The Continental Congress did abolish the importation of enslaved people, but unfortunately that momentum against slavery itself really stalled, especially in the South where the economy was so deeply tied to it.
Beyond slavery, were there other pushes for more democracy?
Definitely. There was a big push for greater political democracy. State legislatures started working toward universal white male suffrage, getting rid of property requirements, titles of nobility. They explicitly abolished granting aristocratic titles, trying to create a more egalitarian political landscape, at least in theory.
And what about women? Did the revolution change things for them?
It did, but in complex ways, the idea of Republican motherhood emerged.
Republican motherhood, what's that?
The idea was that women were crucial to the health of the Republic because their main role was to raise virtuous sons, sons who understood Republican principles. Benjamin Rush wrote an influential essay on female education in 1787, arguing for this.
So, education for women, but for a specific purpose.
Right. It did lead to more schooling for girls, which was an advance. And you had figures like Abigail Adams urging John to remember the ladies when making new laws, asking for more legal protections.
And Judith Sargent Murray.
She took it further. Her 1790 essay on the equality of the sexes argued for women's intellectual equality with men. She pushed for education not just to raise sons, but so women could contribute more broadly to society. It's really early American feminist thought.
But these advances had limits.
Absolutely crucial to remember that. These changes mostly benefited white women. Black women, American Indian women, they saw little to no improvement in their status or rights during this period.
And the American Revolution didn't just change America. It had ripples across the globe, right?
Massive global impact. The French Revolution in 1789 is a prime example. France's finances were already strained from helping the Americans.
Right, the cost you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And the ideas, liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, they resonated hugely in France. The storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, direct echoes of the American experience, even borrowing language.
And then Haiti.
The Haitian Revolution, starting in 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture. This was monumental, the first successful revolution by enslaved people, leading to the first independent Black-led nation in the Western Hemisphere, directly inspired by the American and French examples.
Wow. And Latin America, too.
Yeah, the success in North America and Haiti definitely helped spark independence movements across Latin America against Spanish and Portuguese rule. Mexico, Peru, Venezuela, Chile, all starting to stir. A real domino effect.
Okay, back in America, they needed a government, but they were wary of strong central power.
Extremely wary. That fear of repeating what they saw as British tyranny, that kind of monarchy hangover, heavily influenced their first attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation.
So how did that fear, that monarchy hangover, actually shape the Articles? What did it look like in practice?
It meant they designed a central government that was deliberately weak. Ratified in 1781, it had very limited powers. No national executive, no president, no national Supreme Court. Just a unicameral legislature, one house where every state got just one vote, regardless of size.
One vote per state. That must have caused issues.
It did. And changing anything was incredibly hard. Amendments required agreement from 9 out of the 13 states. It was designed to be rigid, reflecting that deep distrust of centralized authority they developed under the British Crown.
But it wasn't a complete failure, was it? Didn't the Articles achieve anything positive?
It did have one major success story, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
What did that do?
It laid out a process for governing the territories northwest of the Ohio River. Importantly, it promoted public education, protected private property, and this is key, it banned slavery in that territory. It also set up an orderly way for these territories to eventually become states. That was a big achievement.
Okay, so one big success. But then there was a critical failure that really exposed his weaknesses.
Yes, Shays' Rebellion. In the mid-1780s, you had these farmers in western Massachusetts. Many were Revolutionary War veterans struggling with debt and high taxes. They started protesting, shutting down courts.
And the national government couldn't help.
Exactly. Massachusetts asked for federal help to put down the rebellion. But under the Articles, there was no president to call out troops, no federal army to send. Massachusetts had to handle it themselves.
So Shays' Rebellion really highlighted the problem.
It starkly exposed the weakness. The fear grew that the country could fall apart into chaos, or similar rebellions could pop up elsewhere. It convinced many influential leaders that the Articles of Confederation was basically a flawed document in need of replacing. It just wasn't strong enough.
Which leads directly to the next major step, the Constitutional Convention and the debates over ratification. Philadelphia, 1787. This wasn't just about tweaking the Articles anymore, was it?
No, it was a direct response to the failures, especially Shays' Rebellion. The 55 delegates who gathered there aimed to create a whole new constitution, one that gave the federal government significantly more power. Shays' Rebellion really pushed them past the idea of just patching up the old system.
What were the big sticking points they had to hammer out?
Representation was a huge one.
Yeah.
How should states be represented in the new Congress? This led to the Great Compromise.
Between the big states and the small states.
Right. You had the Virginia Plan, favored by larger states, pushing for representation based on population, and the New Jersey Plan, favored by smaller states, wanting equal representation for every state.
So the compromise was?
A bicameral legislature, 2 houses. The House of Representatives, where representation is based on population, satisfying the big states, and the Senate, where each state gets 2 votes, regardless of size, satisfying the small states.
A classic compromise. But then there was the even tougher issue, slavery. How did they handle that?
Very contentiously, and through compromises that would have long-lasting, devastating consequences. First, the 3/5 compromise.
How'd that work?
It decided that for purposes of representation in the House and also for taxation, 3/5 of the enslaved population in a state would be counted. It gave southern states more power in Congress than their free population warranted.
And the slave trade itself.
Another compromise. To get Southern states on board with the Constitution, the convention agreed that the federal government couldn't ban the international slave trade until 1808, basically kicking that can down the road for 20 years.
So compromises built on moral contradictions, really.
Deeply problematic compromises, absolutely. They also decided on how the government would be elected. Direct election for the House of Representatives. State legislatures would choose the senators that changed later with the 17th Amendment.
And the president.
Not directly elected by the people, they created the Electoral College. The idea, as some delegates argued, was to remove the presidential election from the hands of the people and put it into what they saw as a more capable, smaller group.
Okay, so they hammer out this new constitution, but getting it approved, ratified, that wasn't easy either.
Not at all. It sparked this fierce nationwide debate. Two main camps emerged. You had the Federalist people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. They supported the Constitution and wrote the brilliant Federalist Papers to argue for it, explaining how it would work and why it was necessary.
And the opposition.
They were the anti-federalists. Figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason. They feared the new central government would be too powerful, that it would trample on states' rights and individual liberties. And their biggest criticism was the lack of a Bill of Rights explicitly protecting those liberties.
That seems like a pretty major omission.
It was. And the Federalists realized they had to concede on that point to win ratification.
So they promised a Bill of Rights.
Exactly. That was the key compromise. They promised that once the Constitution was ratified, the first order of business would be to add amendments spelling out fundamental rights, freedom of speech, religion, press, right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, or so on. That promise was crucial in securing ratification in key states.
And it worked.
It did. By mid-1788, enough states had ratified, and the Constitution became the new framework for the United States government. The Bill of Rights followed shortly after in 1791.
All right, so the Constitution is ratified. Let's unpack the Constitution. Structure and functions. You mentioned it created a limited but dynamic central government. What are the key themes here?
Two really big ones stand out: federalism and the separation of powers.
Federalism, that's about the relationship between the national government and the states.
Precisely. It's the idea of sharing power. It doesn't mean one level is automatically supreme over the other in all things. It means they both have their own spheres of authority.
How does the Constitution define that sharing?
Well, you have the Supremacy Clause in Article 6. It
Yeah.
basically says that when the Constitution grants a specific power to the national government, like declaring war or regulating interstate commerce, national law is supreme over state law in those areas.
But states still have powers.
Absolutely. The 10th Amendment makes that clear. It says any powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government nor denied to the states are reserved for the states or the people. Things like establishing local governments, running schools, marriage laws, those are generally state powers. So power is shared, divided.
Okay, that's federalism. What about the separation of powers?
This is about preventing tyranny within the federal government itself. It divides the national government's power among three distinct branches.
The familiar legislative, executive, and judicial.
Exactly. The legislative branch, Congress, makes the laws. The executive branch, headed by the president, enforces the laws. And the judicial branch, the court system, topped by the Supreme Court, interprets the laws.
And they're designed to keep each other in check.
That's the crucial part: checks and balances. Each branch has ways to limit the power of the other two. For example, Congress passes a law. The president can veto it, check Congress. But Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, checking the president. The courts can declare laws unconstitutional, checking both Congress and the president.
So it's an intentionally complex system.
Very intentional. The framers were deeply skeptical of concentrated power. As James Madison famously wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. They assumed people in power would try to abuse it, so they built this system of checks and balances, this division of power through federalism and separation, specifically to make tyranny difficult. It was their plan to protect liberty.
Okay, the framework is in place. But now the new republic has to actually function, navigate the world, deal with internal issues. Let's explore how it began shaping a new republic, early challenges, and political development. What were some immediate hurdles?
Well, foreign policy was a big one right away. Britain and Spain were still major presences in North America, often causing friction on the frontiers.
How did the U.S. handle that? Treaties.
Yeah, diplomacy was key. Jay's Treaty in 1795 got the British to finally abandon their military posts in the Northwest Territory, though it was controversial for other reasons. Pinckney's Treaty, also 95, was a big win with Spain. It secured American access to trade down the Mississippi River and set the southern U.S. border.
And Spain was still expanding elsewhere.
Right, Spain was expanding its mission system out in California, often using forced labor from local American Indian populations. This led to significant cultural mixing and, of course, exploitation.
What about the French Revolution? That must have caused ripples.
Huge ripples. It really divided Americans. President Washington, worried the young nation was too fragile, issued a proclamation of neutrality in 1793, trying to keep the U.S. out of the European wars that erupted.
Was everyone happy with neutrality?
No, Thomas Jefferson and his supporters were much more sympathetic to the French revolutionaries and wanted closer ties. Then you had incidents like the Citizen Genet affair, where a French minister tried to recruit Americans directly, undermining neutrality. Washington had to demand his recall.
And the XYZ affair?
That was later, 1797-98, under President Adams. French agents demanded a bribe just for U.S. diplomats to even talk to the French foreign minister. It caused massive outrage back in the States, almost leading to war with France. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became the slogan.
Meanwhile, what was happening with westward expansion and Native Americans?
Constant conflict, unfortunately. Especially in the Ohio River Valley, settlers kept pushing west, leading to clashes.
Any major battles or treaties?
The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 was significant. The U.S. Army defeated a confederacy of Native American tribes. This led to the Treaty of Greenville, where the tribes were forced to give up huge amounts of land in Ohio, opening it up for more American settlement.
What was the government's general approach to Native Americans?
It was complex and often contradictory. The Indian Intercourse Act of 1790 tried to put dealings with native tribes under federal control, supposedly to make things more orderly and fair, but it often didn't work out that way. And the Commerce Clause of the Constitution actually recognized tribes as distinct political entities, sovereign independent nations in theory when making treaties. But in practice, Washington had used a brutal scorched earth policy against the Iroquois during the Revolution because they sided with the British. So policy and practice were often different.
Domestically, how did the new government under Washington and Adams start functioning, setting up the bureaucracy?
Washington established the first presidential cabinet key advisors like Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton especially had a huge impact. He pushed through a plan to stabilize the nation's finances, including assuming state debts and, controversially, creating a national bank.
The national bank was controversial. Why?
Because the Constitution didn't explicitly say Congress could create a bank. Jefferson and Madison argued it was unconstitutional, an overreach of federal power. But Hamilton argued it was necessary and proper for Congress to carry out its duties, like collecting taxes and regulating currency. Washington sided with Hamilton. It was a major early debate about interpreting the Constitution.
And this new, stronger federal government showed its muscle pretty quickly.
Yes. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 is the classic example. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were protesting a federal tax on whiskey. Unlike Shays' Rebellion under the Articles, this time the federal government responded forcefully. Washington himself actually led troops part of the way to put down the uprising.
A very different outcome than Shays.
A stark contrast. It demonstrated the new government's power and willingness to enforce federal law. But these economic policies and interpretations of the Constitution also deepened political divisions.
Leading to the first political parties.
Exactly. You see the emergence of the Federalists, led by Hamilton, favoring a strong central government, manufacturing, urban interests, closer ties with Britain, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, emphasizing states' rights, agriculture, rural interests, and more sympathy towards France. These became the first 2 major political parties.
And Washington warned against these actions.
He did, famously, in his farewell address. He cautioned against the dangers of political parties dividing the nation and also warned against getting entangled in permanent foreign alliances. Wise advice, but the divisions were already pretty deep.
Things got even more heated under Adams.
Yeah, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were really controversial. Passed by the Federalist Congress during the quasi-war with France, they made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and made it a crime to criticize the government.
Sounds like a direct attack on free speech.
It was seen that way by the Democratic Republicans. Their response came in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, secretly drafted by Madison and Jefferson. These argued that states had the right to judge the constitutionality of federal laws and even nullify laws they deemed unconstitutional. That idea of nullification would echo later in American history, particularly leading up to the Civil War.
So the political battles were fierce from the start. Alongside this, with a distinct American identity starting to form. Let's talk about developing an American identity, culture, and society. How did art, literature, architecture start reflecting this new nation?
Yeah, you definitely see a conscious effort to create a uniquely American culture separate from European roots. In art, for instance,
Who are some key figures?
Charles Wilson Peale and John Trumbull are good examples. They painted portraits of revolutionary leaders like Washington and Franklin, and they painted these grand, sometimes romanticized scenes of historical events like the signing of the Declaration. The goal was partly to create national heroes and instill patriotic pride.
Were they just painting famous white men?
Mostly, but Samuel Jennings was interesting. He sometimes included women and black figures in his depictions of American life, which was less common and hinted at the more complex reality.
What about literature? Were writers trying to define what it meant to be American?
Absolutely. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac was hugely popular even before the Revolution, and it helped shape this image of the American as industrious, thrifty, self-reliant.
And after the Revolution?
Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer, published in 1782, famously asked, "What then is the American, this new man?" He painted this picture of someone escaping European hierarchies, connected to the land, forging a new identity through hard work.
Were there darker literary themes too?
Yes, Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland from 1798 is considered the first American Gothic novel. It explored themes of religious fanaticism, madness, and violence, reflecting some of the anxieties and uncertainties bubbling beneath the surface of the new republic.
And architecture. Did that reflect the new nation's ideals?
It tried to. The dominant style became known as federal architecture. It drew heavily on classical Greek and Roman forms, think columns, domes, symmetry. You see it in buildings like Jefferson's Monticello or the first Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. The idea was to convey strength, order, rationality, democracy, linking the new republic to the perceived virtues of classical antiquity.
And religious freedom. That was a big part of the identity too, right?
A cornerstone. Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was incredibly influential. It established the separation of church and state in Virginia, arguing that government shouldn't compel religious belief or support any particular church. This principle became central to American identity.
And religion was also a way for marginalized groups to express themselves.
Yes, definitely. Look at someone like Gowan Pamphlet. He was an enslaved man in Virginia who became the first ordained Black Baptist preacher in America, founding a church. For many marginalized people, religion offered a space for community, leadership, and expressing their own American identity, often blending religious faith with hopes for freedom and equality.
Okay, our final section looks at movement in the early republic, migration and the intensifying debate over slavery. Expert, you mentioned westward migration earlier.
Yeah.
This really picked up steam after the Revolution.
Massively. The U.S. population almost doubled between 1776 and 1800, and a lot of that growth was pushing westward across the Appalachians.
Which inevitably led to more conflict with Native Americans.
Inevitably. It was a period of intense, often violent conflict over land and resources. Native American groups were constantly trying to figure out how to resist this tide, sometimes forming alliances amongst themselves, sometimes seeking alliances with remaining European powers.
The British and Spanish were still involved.
Oh, yeah. They continued to have relationships, including alliances with various Native American groups on the frontiers, partly as a way to check American expansion. This added another layer of complexity and tension.
We mentioned the Western Confederacy and the Battle of Fallen Timbers. That was a turning point.
It was a major setback for Native resistance in the Ohio Valley. The Western Confederacy had successfully limited settlement for a while, but their defeat at Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the resulting Treaty of Greenville forced them to cede vast territories.
And the U.S. government's role in these conflicts.
The federal government, under the Constitution, took over control of Indian affairs from the states with things like the Indian Intercourse Act of 1790. But in practice, the government consistently sided with white settlers in disputes over land. This was actually a shift from British policy before the Revolution, which had tried somewhat to limit westward expansion with the Proclamation Line. The U.S. government actively facilitated it.
This westward movement created its own kind of frontier culture, didn't it?
It did. You get these larger-than-life folk heroes emerging, like Daniel Boone, the explorer and frontiersman in Kentucky, or John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, planting orchards as he traveled.
But there were tensions within that frontier society, too.
For sure. You had terms like squatters or crackers used to describe poor, landless migrants pushing west. There was this dual image. Sometimes they were seen as embodying American values of independence and hardiness, but other times they were looked down upon, even called white savages.
And violence wasn't just between settlers and Native Americans.
No, there was violence among settlers and also organized violence by settlers against Native Americans. The Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania back in the 1760s were an early example, a vigilante group that massacred peaceful Conestoga Indians. These kinds of tensions and white supremacist violence were part of the frontier reality.
Okay, let's pivot to the other huge issue intensifying during this period, slavery. How are regional attitudes changing or hardening?
You see a growing divergence. In the North, anti-slavery sentiment was definitely increasing, particularly among groups like the Quakers and Mennonites who had opposed it on religious grounds for a long time.
We mentioned Franklin's petition and gradual abolition in some states.
Right. Benjamin Franklin presented an anti-slavery petition to Congress in 1790, though it failed, and New England states especially moved towards emancipation, leading to larger free black populations there.
But resistance from enslaved people themselves continued.
Absolutely. Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia in 1800 is a stark example. Inspired partly by the ideals of the American and Haitian revolutions, Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith, planned a large-scale uprising to seize Richmond and end slavery.
What happened?
The plot was discovered before it could launch, and Gabriel and many others were executed. The response in Virginia and other southern states wasn't to question slavery, but to implement even stricter slave codes, tightening control over enslaved people and restricting the rights of free blacks.
So while the North was slowly moving away from slavery, the South was digging in and expanding it.
Dramatically expanding it. The key invention here was Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793.
How did the cotton gin change things so drastically?
It made processing short staple cotton much, much easier and incredibly profitable. Suddenly, cotton became the cash crop for the South. This led to a massive expansion of cotton plantations across the Deep South.
And that required more labor.
An insatiable demand for enslaved labor. Since the international slave trade was set to close in 1808, this fueled a massive internal slave trade.
Meaning enslaved people being moved within the U.S.?
Yes. Hundreds of thousands, estimates range from 500,000 to over 1 million over the subsequent decades, were forcibly transported from the Upper South, like Virginia and Maryland, to the new cotton plantations in the Lower South and Southwest. Families were torn apart. It was brutal.
And slavery spread geographically, too.
Yes. As cotton cultivation rapidly depleted soil nutrients, planters constantly sought new land westward, taking the institution of slavery with them into new territories like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana.
You mentioned the international trade closing in 1808. Was there a rush before then?
There was a significant surge. In the roughly 20 years between the Constitution's ratification, 1787-88, and the 1808 ban, about 200,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the U.S. To put that in perspective, that's nearly half the total number brought over during the entire previous 180 years of the colonial slave trade. So the founding era, paradoxically, saw both the beginnings of abolition in the North and a massive intensification and geographic expansion of slavery fueled by cotton in the South.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've journeyed from colonies chafing under British rule through a revolution fought for liberty to the creation of an independent nation. But a nation immediately grappling with its own identity, figuring out the balance of power, and facing these deep, deep internal divisions, especially over slavery.
That's a great summary. The ideas of liberty and self-governance that were really ignited during this period, 1754 to 1800, they absolutely continue to shape the United States, the debates, the struggles, everything, right down to today.
It's clear the foundations laid were complex, often contradictory.
Indeed. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. When you consider how this early republic was forged through such intense debates, such difficult compromises, particularly around federal power versus states' rights, individual liberties, and the fundamental contradiction of slavery in a nation championing freedom, what enduring lessons can we maybe draw from that? What does it tell us about the nature of compromise, conflict, and maybe even progress in the ongoing story of building and rebuilding a nation? Something to ponder.